and said that the Pope's decisions were final. The decree was titled Execrabilis, and it asserted the Pope's position as the Vicar of Christ. Again, we made the distinction, right? Vicar of Peter, Vicar of Christ, a much more radical thing to claim to be the Vicar of Christ. They said he was the Vicar of Christ who had the power to bind and loose both in heaven and on earth. The decree also declared that anyone who appealed a papal decision was cursed to hell and could not be helped by anyone except by the Pope himself, and that only on his deathbed. So this was one of the strongest statements or declarations of papal authority and power. Let me say that again. Anybody who doubted or appealed a papal decision was automatically cursed to hell. And the only one who could save you from a sure destiny in hell was the Pope himself. You know, the man who wrote this papal bull, Pope Pius II, his career was interesting as an example of the depravity of the popes in that day. He was born in the year 1405 as one of 18 children. To a family that was poor but of noble rank. He was educated and began working as an assistant to various bishops and cardinals. He had a good instinct for politics, and so he was able to side with whoever was in power at the time, and he knew how to ingratiate himself with the church bureaucracy. Though he was eventually appointed a bishop, then he was appointed a cardinal, and when he was 53 years old, he was selected among the cardinals as pope. His sexual immorality was well known. He fathered at least 2 children, and he had many, many mistresses. He openly liked to brag about his ability to seduce women. He said that his sexual appetite was an old vice. And he said, listen, I can't be wiser than Solomon or holier than David, so I'll indulge myself with women. He even wrote and published erotic stories and taught young men how to seduce women. He appointed a nephew of his a cardinal when he was only 23, and later on he appointed a family friend to the same office of cardinal when the boy was only 17. Once Pope Pius II excommunicated a man for keeping his hat on in the presence of the Pope. On another time, he visited Siena, and he met a man named Rodrigo Borgia, who even Pius rebuked for his immorality. And notice, this man Borgia was so wicked that Pius rebuked him for his immorality. This man Borgia would give immoral and licentious banquets where women were invited to attend without their husbands. Borgia went on to become Pope Alexander VI, who ruled immorally. But he was the same pope who commissioned Michelangelo to sculpt the Pieta. Now, again, I want you to get this picture, right? Corruption, immorality, but yet great artistic accomplishments, right? It's very interesting. You go to the Vatican today and you see the amazing sculptures. You stare at Michelangelo's Pieta and you say, wow, what an amazing work of art. But then to realize that it was commissioned by a pope who was so immoral that even Pope Pius II, who was immoral himself, thought he was off the wall. And this was really remarkable. In the year 1458, Pius attempted to call another crusade, but he had trouble raising the money among the kings of Europe. The Germans opposed his attempt to raise money by establishing what they called a crusade tax. And when they issued their opposition, they pointed out Pius's past of notorious sin. Pius responded with this papal bull Execrabilis, which condemned any authority a council might claim over a pope. In the year 1464, he personally led a crusading army against the Turks, and he was stricken with fever, and he died while he was on the crusade. Pius wasn't much of a spiritual leader, but he was a very cultured man and a good writer. He wrote recognized works of poetry, history, fiction, and speeches. One series of his Latin poems is noticed for its influence on 15th century English satire. In the year 1462, Pius II gave an elaborate celebration to commemorate the coming to Rome of what was said to be the skull of the Apostle Andrew. He fell down prostrate before the relic, and he congratulated the skull for coming out of its grave to the remains of its brother apostles. Some of his last words were, pray for me, for I am a sinner. And by the way, Pius II is recognized historically as one of the great popes of the Roman Catholic Church. Pius II asserted that he was the single monarch over all Christians. He said that he received his authority directly from Jesus, and all other Christians received their authority from Jesus through the Pope. He declared himself the prince of all bishops and the heir of the apostles. Well, this is an example of the kind of low status. You can see this other flashing light, right? Corruption, reform needed. And listen, all of Europe saw this. All of Europe knew of the corruption of the popes. From the year 1450 to the year 1517, when Martin Luther made his famous, nailing of the 95 Theses on the door of Wittenberg, the church door there were 10 popes. And most of them were exceedingly corrupt men, far more interested in political power than in anything spiritual. They did nothing for the cause of Christianity except perhaps to propose a crusade to take back the city of Constantinople from the Muslims. But even that was motivated by almost pure greed. The nepotism of those times was unbelievable. These men who were supposed to be celibate priests freely had mistresses and wives, and their illegitimate offspring were acknowledged without a blush. They would often make a good place for their sons and nephews by appointing them as cardinals, who are second only to the Pope in their office in the church. A church council tried to curb the practice by saying, no, you can only make somebody a cardinal if they're 30 years old. But that was ignored by the Pope. Teenagers were routinely appointed as cardinals, and they are even some cases of an 8-year-old and a 7-year-old being appointed as a cardinal. Now, why would they do it? Why would you appoint an 8-year-old as cardinal? Remember what I told you before about the money attached to each office? Well, listen, if a bishop's office had money attached to it, you can only imagine the money that was attached to a cardinal's office. And so a pope would appoint, his illegitimate 8-year-old son as a cardinal because the money that would come into the office would go to the pope. You see, like a multi-level scheme, a cardinal was appointed over a certain territory, and he received a cut of all the contributions. Essentially, they were church taxes that came into his region. The dollar value of the offices of cardinal and bishop meant that they were offices that would be bought and sold. Routinely, the office of bishop was sold to the highest bidder, and he would use the income of that office as a means to pay off the purchase price of the office. They say by the time of the Reformation, the first thing that the Pope would do every day was call in his financial advisor and decide what church offices they would sell that day. The Vatican became a place where art and entertainment ruled, where popes and cardinals were wealthy and cultured patrons of the arts. They entertained prostitutes with banquets and immoral comedies. If you want a good example of the difficulties of those times, I want you to look at 3 notable pre-Reformation popes. These are the 3 popes that did any amount of ruling. There were some popes who ruled for very brief periods within this time. But these 3 popes did any amount of ruling before the Reformation. Look at their names: Alexander VI, Julius II, and Leo X. Now, what do you notice about these names? These are the kinds of names that emperors would have, right? Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, Leo like a lion, right? Where are the biblical names? Where are the spiritual names? They're out the window. Now popes began to see themselves as spiritual emperors, but not just spiritual emperors, economic emperors, political emperors. There was tremendous problem and corruption within the papal office. Again, it was like a flashing light that said, reform, reform, reform. Now, that's a pretty dark picture of how the church was, right? So it's fair to ask ourselves, where was the true church during these times of great corruption? And the answer is this: there has always existed a church that was outside the official and recognized church. What you might call a believer's church, or what some people call a pilgrim church. And I think it's important for us to consider this. This is taken from that great book by Broadman, I think his name is. His name escapes me just at the moment, called The Pilgrim Church. And this is what he says. He says, the true histories of these, he means these true believers outside the formal church, the true histories of these have been obliterated as far as possible. Their writings, sharing the fate of the writers, have been destroyed to the full extent of the power allowed to their persecutors. Not only so, but the histories of them have been promulgated by those whose interest it was to disseminate the worst inventions against them in order to justify their own cruelties. In such accounts they are depicted as heretics, and evil doctrines are ascribed to them which they repudiated. I want you to notice this. You know, when you go through the history of the church and read about this heretical group or that heretical group, you can't always believe what the official line is, right? Some of these groups were right-on believers who were slandered and lied about because they didn't fit into the institutional church. Other times, maybe they were sincere, true believers that had a few beliefs that were strange or aberrant, sort of like that we saw in the Montanists, but they in no way deserved the scorn and the hatred that the institutional church put upon them. He goes on to say they are called sects, and labels are attached to them which they themselves would not acknowledge. They usually called themselves Christians or brethren, but numerous names were given to them by others in order to create the impression that they represented many new, strange, and unconnected sects. It is therefore difficult to trace their history. What their adversaries have written of them must be suspected. Words from their own lips wrung out by torture are valueless. So again, we have to understand that even in the first 3 centuries, there were numerous bodies of Christians who protested against the growing laxity and worldliness of the church and against this departure from the teachings of Scripture. For example, there were some who were wrongly associated with cults like the Manichaeans. There were also those who were called Paulicans, those who were called Thonraks, those who were called Bogomils or Bulgarians, those who were called Albengenses. These people are examples of groups that were probably right on. It's a little hard to tell from a historical perspective because it was only their victors who were able to write the histories. But we know some things about some of these movements. For example, in the year 653, a man named Constantine received a man on a journey. An Armenian man who was captured by the Saracens, the Muslims, and was released and was on his way back home. As they spent time together, it was apparent that the Armenian visitor had something precious that he was very excited about. He had a manuscript with him that contained the 4 Gospels and the letters of Paul. He ended up leaving those manuscripts with Constantine, who made these writings the focus of his continued study. His life was radically changed by the Scriptures, and he changed his name to Silvanus, who was the companion of the Apostle Paul, right? Silas? He said, I want to be like that. So he connected with other believers who didn't like the icon worship and the superstitious nature of the Eastern or the Byzantine church, and therefore he became the target of persecution. For about 30 years he worked in Armenia and traveled all around the region doing ministry. By the year 684, his ministry was so effective that the emperor issued a decree against the congregations of believers and against Silvanus himself. The emperor sent a special aide named Simeon to get Silvanus, and when he found him, he gathered many of his followers, gave them rocks, and commanded them to stone Silvanus to death. When they refused, and again, you refuse to order like that at the risk of your own life, he found one man named Justus who had been brought up by Silvanus as an adopted son and who had received special kindness from him. And Justus was willing to execute Silvanus, and he did. Simeon was so affected by this and by the whole scene that he converted and became a follower of Jesus Christ. Now listen, you got to say, this is just one small story that we know about. But again, what was the key for this man Constantine and what changed his life? It was getting the Bible, right? When he received that copy of the 4 Gospels and the letters of Paul, it turned his life around. And herein we see one of the greatest crimes of the medieval church was keeping the Bible from the people. Constantine was different. He got the Bible, he loved it, he taught it, and you can just imagine how many times this same scene was repeated over and over again in the history of the church. There was another leader that we can talk about, a guy named Sergius. In Armenia,